have and invited me up. I have just like a short presentation. It's more just going to be kind of me talking through my experience. So it's a good kind of overlap. But basically, like, what's the relationship between audience and community? What's my experience been? Not really so much of like a how-to, but more of a here's what I've done and here's been my experience with turning an audience into a community. What are the differences between them? How do I think about building an audience and also building a community? So I'll kind of fly through it pretty quickly here. But again, this is sort of my background. Cordial, went to Barometrics, Hey Marketers, created 2 courses. Now I've been working on Swipe Files. Swipe Files is my COVID business baby, as it were. So I started working on it in March of 2020. And so it's been just over a year now. And then September of 2020 was when I left my job at Barometrics. And so coming up on that anniversary as well now. And then, okay, yeah, so here we go. Sort of just kind of the next slide here. January, actually I should say January 2021, gotta fix that. I launched on Product Hunt. But basically what I wanted to talk about today was, I think that a lot of people, and Rosie, if you're still around, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and anyone else who has thoughts on this as well, but just the relationship between audience and community. And one, I want to start with the fact that I think that a lot of us know the nuances and understand the nuances because we're in it. We're community, managers, organizers, we're parts of community, but it's sort of a pet peeve of mine when people use the two interchangeably, because there's actually a really big difference. And if you want to get to a community eventually, I think you actually have to start with an audience. The two sort of have like this symbiotic relationship, but I think that everything usually starts with having an audience. So we'll talk about what that means, what it actually means to have an audience. But if you really want to get to a community first, that step one is actually having an audience. The reason being, if you really think about the differences between them, an audience is when you have one-to-many relationship with people, right? So instead of it being like one-to-one where it's just me and Anthony, or just me and Rosie, or it's just me, now they can subscribe to my newsletter, they can follow me on Twitter, they can engage with me in a number of different ways. And now I can press send once, or I can interact once, and then it'll engage with them as if it was a one-to-one kind of relationship with them, right? So it's relationships at scale, right? And whereas a community is where each of those people that you're interacting with are also interacting with each other, right? One of the tests I heard a while back was, you have an audience or a community if you leave and you go MIA for a while. What happens, right? Do people still interacting with each other? Are they still talking with each other? Are they still connecting? Is there still content being produced? If not, you have an audience. If so, then yeah, you have a community, right? But those are the differences between them. An audience is where you have relationships at scale with people, and a community is when people have relationships with each other at scale. So step one part is audience. I want to talk about that, how to build an audience, so that eventually we can turn to the person next to you and say, hey, you guys should get to know each other. And then now you have a community. So here's how I think about building an audience and marketing in general, getting your work out into the world. It's basically earning trust at scale. I think that with marketing, there's a lot of negative connotations and conflation around manipulation and trickery and selling, and kind of like these icky feelings of being pressured to do things or being lied to even. Basically, just kind of false advertising, right, is a big part of it. But those are the really like negative extremes, and those are absolutely true in a lot of cases. But on the positive end of things as well, it's really about earning trust. It's about building relationships at scale, building that one-to-many sort of relationships with people. It's about what Seth Godin defines it as, is he says that marketing is bringing your work into the world in a way that the world can receive it. So it's spreading a message, right? It's actually an act of service. If you see your knowledge, your product, your service, whatever it is that you bring to the world, if you see that as a valuable thing that will improve people's lives and give them something that they couldn't get before, it'll solve a problem, it'll save them time, it will tell them something new, it'll entertain them in some way, then you are actually doing them a service by bringing your product, knowledge, service to them. Marketing is a service in that sense, right? It's a positive thing. It's a beneficial thing to the world. And so I love this phrase, earning trust at scale, because if you break those two bits up, right? First we get, okay, how do we earn trust? What does that mean? And then how do we do those things at scale? Now, let me take you to another kind of concept and framework here. I'm a big frameworks person. And I actually have a course on it, mental models for marketing, but this actually isn't one of the ones in here. So sort of a newer idea I've been workshopping. But basically, any sort of audience building strategy, marketing tactic, thing that you put out into the world, content you produce, usually falls into one of three buckets, and it can kind of bleed between them, but usually it's one of three. It's on an owned platform, and that's what you're building on. That's the relationship that you have with your audience. It's on a rented platform, or it's on a borrowed platform. And I intentionally put them in these kind of concentric circles where one is inside the other and another is inside that one, because I want to communicate that there's different levels of depth and breadth for each one of these. So for owned platforms, it's going to be small breadth, right? It's going to be a small amount of people, but you're going to have really deep relationships with them. It's going to be a very intimate form of communication. You're going to have a direct relationship with your audience. With a rented platform, it's kind of somewhere in between, right? Where you have a good mix of breadth and depth, where you can build relationships, you can get to know people, and you can do that sort of at a good amount of scale. But you're not going to reach everyone, and it's not going to be the most intimate form of communication. And usually with rented platforms, you're going to be subject to things like algorithms and distribution factors and ranking factors, and you have to play by the rules essentially, right? So if you think about owning a home, you can do anything. You can tear that home down, you can build it up, you can put new homes on there, you can change the wall color, whatever that you want, right? You make the rules. With the rented platforms, you have to abide by the rules. You can't just tear down the kitchen in my apartment that I'm renting, right? Because while I have the right to live here, I still have to play by the rules, and I pay rent every month here. It's sort of this is mine, but it's not a permanent place, right? A lot of things can change eventually. If they wanted to remodel, if they wanted to kick me out, they could do that within reason. And then we have borrowed platforms. So this is leveraging the trust, again, where the relationship is the most shallow, it's the least deep, but you reach the most amount of people. So the reason I bring this up is because for a lot of audience building, oops, a little bit of a delay there. You want to grow. You want to grow your own platform. That is the ideal. That is the cream of the crop. The end goal. What you want to get to is you want to grow your blog, your newsletter, your podcast, and your community, right? Because these are the most intimate forms of communication with your audience, with the people that you want to serve. And really, actually, I think that community is like the ultimate owned platform, and it's the ultimate place for you to interact with people, because it combines a lot of different types of media. And with chat, it's really like, that's where you get the most intimate form of, making people feel like they're a part of something. They're in a community. But to build and to grow an owned community, you have to bring people in from there, right? Where do they come from? How do you find them? How do they find out about you? Well, usually you have to meet them on a rented platform like Twitter or like YouTube, like TikTok, like LinkedIn, like a lot of these sort of rented platforms where you have a profile there, you're listed there, and you have a following there, but it's still not yours per se, And if you were on Facebook a few years ago, you would see your organic reach just kind of like just go off a cliff, because they changed the algorithms, and they really favored Facebook groups, and then like the whole like friends thing became very diluted, and then pages just like went to zero basically. Like no one saw pages anymore. Twitter and LinkedIn and TikTok these days have like a lot of, or have really good organic reach. TikTok especially, actually. Instagram's kind of like a close back, right? So each one of these has their own trade-offs, but basically you're meeting your audience where they're at, and that's where so when you write a blog post, you post it to Twitter, because that's how you're going to get people there, right? Or you're going to list it, or you're going to be indexed by Google, or you're going to write for a byline, or et cetera, right? There's a few different places that you drive traffic and drive people back to your own platform. But even with your rented platform, that's still not the the silver bullet. Even then, you can have a cold start problem of not growing your rented platform, or it's just not working, right? Like if you're starting from scratch, How do you grow that? Well, you have to borrow other people's audiences. You have to borrow their platforms. And so you have to borrow their owned and rented platforms. And usually this is in the case of a win-win scenario, a collaboration, something that is mutually beneficial both to you and to the person who you're borrowing the audience. But the magic here is that one, really no one is doing this very well or strategically. And two, it's a value add. It's not any sort of like manipulation. It's not using it. It's not stealing. You're borrowing someone else's audience. And so I just want for you to imagine who is your ideal community member, person that you have the attention of, someone who's in your audience. Just imagine who that person is. And now imagine that there are tens of thousands of them all in one room. And then someone says, hey, would you like the key to this room? I'll let you write a guest post on my blog. I'll let you send a newsletter to my newsletter list. I'll let you host an AMA in my community. I'll let you fill in the blank, right? There are all sorts of amazing opportunities to get in front of your ideal audience simply by collaborating, simply by borrowing someone else's platform, borrowing someone else's audience. So this is what it looks like. This is kind of just like a visualization right here. But again, with own platforms, this is like the framework for audience building. Own platforms, you have your blog, newsletter, community, even like a text message list, a podcast. These are the most intimate forms of communication. Then we have your rented platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, things like that, right? Even being listed in app stores and app marketplaces and directories and different listings. And then we have your borrowed places, right? Anyone who has the attention of your audience. So how do we strategically go through this? Well, first, it's not rocket science. Make a list of everyone and everything that has the attention of your ideal or preferred audience. And then figure out a win-win way to get in front of that audience and to add value to them. I'll say, as someone who has an audience that other people can borrow, it's huge for me. Like, that's one of the biggest ways that I build my own audience is I borrow someone else's, and it's great for them too because they're borrowing mine in return. Every time I have an AMA in my community and Swipe Files, every time I have a guest in my podcast, everything is marketing. Every time that I write a newsletter or a blog post for someone else's blog, that's one less blog post that they have to write, and vice versa, right? We're just making our lives easier. We're cross promoting, right? We're finding the overlap between them and killing two birds with one stone, if you will. I hate that saying, but the analogy works. Step two then is to meet your audience where they already are, right? So all these things you have to do concurrently in parallel, right? But you're going to do them strategically, knowing that one leads to the other. Your borrowed platforms lead to your rented platforms, which lead to your own platforms. And my rule here is you don't need to be everywhere. I don't know if you follow or if you've read Gary Vee, or if you are a follower of his, but he used to have this thing where he was kind of just like, it was like the surround sound strategy: be everywhere, like be on all the social platforms, have a presence, create content for everything. And I do not subscribe to that strategy. I think for a certain type of person, maybe that works. Or if you're like a big brand, you sort of have to be everywhere. But for most people like you and me, indie hackers, community builders, that's simply not true. I would say pick 1 to 2 to 3 at max places where you're really going to be strategic. I'll show you in a second, but for me personally, it's just Twitter. Like, I don't really mess with any other social platform. You don't need to be everywhere and do all the things. Step 3, invest in own platforms that cater to what your audience wants and what you can deliver. Here's my thing, is that I really, really love teaching. So I like to create a lot of teaching content. I love doing, webinars and workshops like this. I love creating courses. I love writing. I love podcasting. Video stuff, not so much. I'm not like a YouTuber. I also, I don't really love like hopping a lot of calls. I'm more of an introvert, so like that type of stuff just exhausts me. So anyways, figure out what you like to do and what your audience wants, and what's the intersection of those two. That's going to be sort of your sweet spot for your own platforms and the content you create ultimately. Again, you don't need to do all the things, you just need to figure out a couple. For me, it's mainly, well, okay, I'll show you really quickly. So here's my journey for building my audience. So at first, even when I didn't have really like an own platform or even like a strong rented platform, I just did a lot of guest podcasting, a lot of guest workshops, a lot of guest posts. I have a couple of examples here that I pulled from, but this is a webinar that I did with Forget the Funnel, which is a marketing community and site about how I got my job at Baremetrics. I went on a podcast and shared sort of what I learned about everything I was absorbing from our customers at Baremetrics. I wrote a guest post for OpenView Partners, which is a very large established venture capital firm out in Boston on the East Coast, about retention strategies that I learned from our customers at Baremetrics. So I'm just taking and repurposing things that I'm learning, and then I'm giving that away to other people for them to use for their content, but I'm also getting exposure to their audience, right? And I listed here, so I made connections with people like Keaton Shaw. I've written for and contributed to posts on DataBox. Indie Hackers has been a big one for me. Different podcasts, Baremetrics itself, Product Hunt. So those are all, there's lots and lots of strategies here for you. This is just what's been working for me, what I've done. And then you want to be on, for me, I've been on Twitter. So I stopped posting really on LinkedIn, on Facebook or Twitter. Still don't really have a TikTok. I'm not on YouTube, right? Just going to do one thing well, and that is Twitter. It goes fairly well. I have almost 10,000 followers, which maybe sounds like a lot for some people, or maybe sounds like a little for some people. It's sort of like right there in between, sort of like this micro influencer stage, possibly. I don't really care about that. It's more just how many people can I loop into my journey and how many people can I add value to. But still, I can't lie that having around 10,000 followers really helps, because I have this built-in distribution channel. But I still know that could go away sometime. Twitter could change. They could really screw it, and they could really kill the organic reach. And so I still invest in my owned platform. So I have a newsletter with 6,000 subscribers. I have 2 podcasts with a bunch of listeners. I have a website with my blog and the people come to for various things. I post experiments and teardowns and all the newsletter posts there as well. You can see here, this is a graph of my newsletter growth all the way from zero, from May of 2019, I believe it was. Yeah, May of 2019 is when I sort of like launched my personal newsletter. And then, so this is the combination of my personal and Swipe Files, but the vast majority of it now is the Swipe Files newsletter. So it's almost 6,000. You can see that's kind of just been like long, slow, steady growth, except for that one little bump there, which I believe, was Product Hunt. So that gives you a nice little kicker. Now, step 2, once you have an audience, then you can get to community. It makes it a lot easier. I'm just going to run through this really quickly, but I just wanted to share how I started the Swipe Files community in turn, given the audience that I've built, and to show you tangibly what that looks like. So first thing I did is I went to my newsletter and said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a community. I think that it's really hard to pull off for marketers, because we're marketers and we market to each other and we share things, and it maybe comes off as kind of spammy and promoty. And I basically shared my experience. Hey, a lot of the communities I've joined aren't active. They're overrun by spammers, or just people abuse it. Maybe they just share things. It's not really active, right? It's not spammy, but it's also not really active. What if there's a marketing community where marketers weren't allowed to market to each other? I'd love to hear from you. What's missing? What would you love to be a part of? Hit reply and tell me. I got tons of replies. I think probably, I don't know, 50 to 100. I can't even look that up. I took a screenshot just of like what was on the first page from my inbox. And it just had a dialogue with people. I just asked them questions. I did the same thing on Twitter then. Hey, if you're a marketer and you're desperate for a private community for marketing, I want to talk to you. Who's interested? A bunch of people responded. Then I DM'd them and I asked them, hey, what are you looking for in another community? I would ask them questions like, are you part of one already? Why or why not? What are you looking for in a marketing community? What do you like about the ones you're in now? What do you not like? What do you think could be improved? Why did you stop checking in on the ones that you left? What would be the one thing that would make a community worth it for you? And I really took a sort of like lean startup product experimentation approach to building a community. Instead of like dreaming up something by myself and having this grand vision like Rosie was talking about earlier, okay, this is just, this is what I want, this is what I think would be cool. You really have to get down to who do you want to serve and what do they want, right? What are you hearing from them? And then build something around what people are telling you that they need. You don't really need to build what they are telling you, what they want, but you need to interpret what they're saying to give them what you think that they need. And that's sort of like the art of product building and of community building. And then I sent another newsletter. Hey, after hearing, I got a lot of really interesting things. If you're interested, I think I'm gonna do this thing. If you're interested in becoming a founding member, reply or DM me, and I'll get back to you. And then, I would ask the questions, say, would love to have you. And then I'll kind of just give them the pitch, right? I'm really looking for people who can help me, build kind of Swipe Files as I build it, help me mold it and grow it. I'd love to have your input, right? Communities in beta. So a lot of, don't have these big expectations, but also it's not in Slack or Facebook. If that still sounds interesting, here's a link, here's a coupon code for half off. So I chose in the beginning, actually, one of the things that people said again was that a lot of marketing communities were spammy, were noisy, or there's just the wrong people there. And so I felt that I needed to align incentives and to charge in order to deliver on the experience that people were looking for, to have a sort of tight-knit community where people could share wins and struggles openly, because in a public community that can be difficult. It can take a large amount of courage and comfortability with that kind of thing. And people just, it seemed like we're craving more of a private, exclusive experience. So that's what I decided to boot up. And this is the number one thing that I took away from that whole experience. Now looking back in hindsight, is that communities always start with one-to-one relationships with the community organizer. I'm really glad that Rosie brought this up earlier, but I really think this is an underrated tactic and key factor in getting a community up off the ground. Is at first, especially, well, yeah, regardless of if you have an audience or not, whatever that means for you, it could be 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people, it doesn't really matter. What matters is their relationship with you and how deep that is. Because if you have 10 people you have a really strong relationship with, even if those 10 people are the extent of your audience, if you have a deep relationship with them, you can start a community. Because when people join a community and they don't know who else is in that community yet, then really the only thing they have to go off of is you, the community organizer. And if they don't know you, you haven't earned their trust, then how can you ask them to join your community, right? You're asking for a really big step. You're assuming a lot. And so actually, to go back to some of these screenshots here, these emails, these replies, the DMs, every single one of these people you see actually right here, Amanda, Stuart, Michelle, Trevor, David, they're all in the Swipe Files community. They're the most active members because I was able to build these strong one-to-one relationships with them before the community. And that actually was the kind of key catalyst to getting the community up and running from the start. And then, in the beginning, when you're first starting, you just want to do things. You want to allow people to introduce themselves, make sure there's clear guidelines, ask people to, post questions, and you want it to feel alive and kind of build momentum when you're first starting out. But it's not rocket science. Get people to post, get friends in early, ask people to introduce themselves, engage with other posts, personally welcome and engage with every single member yourself. You can't really step back as a community member or as a community manager. You have to be active and involved with every single person. I shoot DMs and invite people to have calls with me for every new member that joins. So anyways, not rocket science. One takeaway for you, again, this is not for me. This has been my experience. I'm not the expert. I'm not a community guy. I'm more of an audience guy. But I wanted to show how the two are connected. I think that the number one thing that I've learned about building community is from my friend Jay Klaus. He said, model the behavior you want to see from your community members. And then when you see that behavior, privately and publicly reward it, acknowledge it, tell people thank you for doing that, or give some sort of indirect, nod or check mark or approval or that tells them, hey, what you're doing, I like it. I want more of it, right? People need those sort of positive feedback, those positive reinforcements. Okay, that was a lot. I would love to chat more about the intersection of audience and community, what you guys think. If you have questions or comments on anything that I've said, feel free, the floor is yours.
Corey, that was awesome. I got a lot out of that. For anybody watching, if you want to ask a question live, feel free to ask to share or post it in the chat, and I can ask it for you, wherever your comfort level is today. So I had a question maybe to kick us off. I'm curious what the outreach looks like. When you want to borrow somebody's audience, what does a good pitch look like?
Yeah, you can go about it a couple different ways. If you have an idea of what would be a win-win relationship with them or something that would be a value add, For example, maybe they only have a podcast. Then I mean that outreach is pretty simple because it's basically, hey, how can I get on your podcast? Or if they do a bunch of different things, then you can start with something a little bit more general and ambiguous around, hey, love what you're doing. Just want to introduce myself. Maybe you grab a coffee or you just kind of do like a virtual chat first, get to know them, what they're working on, what they're struggling with. Or you pitch an idea. You say, hey, I think that this would be a really big value add to your audience, given what I know about them, because you're going to do your research, you're going to look at who they are, what kind of people they serve. For example, maybe I go on a podcast about people starting a blog, and I say, so instead of just me pitching my usual thing around, hey, I'm Corey Haines, founder of Swipe Files, yada yada yada. I say, hey, I'm Corey. I noticed that you serve people looking to start a blog. I know that starting a blog is really hard because SEO is really competitive and et cetera. And everyone and their mom has a blog now. I have this framework called the Orb Framework where I talk about how people can build their own rent-to-borrow platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Love to share this on your podcast. I think it'd be really beneficial for your audience given what they're doing, right? So I'm personalizing the pitch based on what I know about them. So the more that you know up front, obviously the easier it is to pitch yourself, because you just want to take the data that you know about them and incorporate that and personalize it into the outreach in a way that makes sense to them and as value add. If you don't know very much, I would say, definitely don't give like the spray and pray, just blast out like a general pitch. Get to know them in some way. There are really easy ways to actually engage with people. Even if you don't have like a personalized pitch, you can review their podcast and send them a screenshot. You can reply to their newsletter and tell them that you enjoyed it or ask them a question. You can shoot them a DM on Twitter and based on one of their tweets and ask them a question or leave a nice comment. Hey, this is cool. I like this. You can share something that they're working on, tag them on Twitter and just say, hey, shout out to this guy. I appreciate their work. And you'll get their sort of you can get their attention that way, right? So just think about how can I help this person, and then the outreach kind of takes care of itself.
Let's see, we got David McNeil here.
Hey, I'm showing and I have some serious sun issue. Let's see. Maybe I can get better. But anyway, it's sunny, can I say. So yeah, great talk. Totally agree with your points on the intersection between audience and community. What I've seen personally with the projects I've been working on in recent months is without an audience, it's very hard to do anything. To get anyone to care, I should say. Of course, you can do things, but doesn't mean it will go anywhere.
Yeah.
And so my question on it is more like, okay, so from my perspective, 10,000 followers on Twitter, 6,000 plus subscribers on email and so on. These are great numbers that I would love to have. And so I'm just trying to kind of understand really how you did it. I mean, I know you talked about it. I know you showed us from 0 to 6,000 and all that great stuff in a chart, but like, and I heard your talk, right? So it's just really hard doing those things. I'm for just as an example, and I guess to get deeper into my question. So I'm doing tons of podcast guesting, and I mean, I plan to do more, guest blogging. I've done some on YouTube, and I want to do more of that. I mean, there's always more and more and more that you can do. And I'm on a couple social media platforms, posting a few times a week. I mean, again, you could do more there, or maybe I should focus on one. But I feel like I'm doing the sort of, at least the basics. At a minimum, I'm doing the basics. And I'm not seeing the 6,000, 10,000, 100,000 numbers that everyone would love to see. And I'm just trying to kind of understand if you can get into that in any more depth or, articulation. And also, I mean, maybe it's a matter as well, or I suppose it's a side question, but like, for example, for the podcast guesting, I'm going targeted in terms of my niche. However, I'm also spending time doing things like, probably talking to very small podcast hosts, like guesting on their shows. From my point of view, if I'm on their blog or their website, whatever, as a guest, and they post it on social media and so on, then I feel like net it's still worth my time. I mean, I'm still trying to get my name out there, and it maybe can pay dividends down the road and just show my intention to be, to be public and so on. But I recognize if you're on, doing well on Product Hunt, you got Hiten Shah, or however you say his name, as your best buddy, these guys have some serious sway. So maybe that, and also obviously with your professional background, you've done a lot, head of growth and so on. So maybe, do you feel like that was also kind of built in, that yes, you started at 0 subscribers, but in a way you weren't like junior marketers straight out of university either, right? So I'm just trying to it's a lot of stuff, but if you could just talk about it a bit.
Yeah.
I want to get past, I want to start building, and it always takes time, but definitely have not seen the results that you've seen in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I hear you on all those fronts. Speaking like a true kind of growth marketer, I think usually what it comes down to for audience building is like an acquisition problem or an activation problem. And for the acquisition side of things, you need to either like ramp up the volume and just keep doing more and more and more, or get into borrow larger and larger platforms, because that can be the case, right? That maybe it's just the things you are doing aren't reaching enough people for it to really make sense or give you the growth that you want. The thing that I struggle with all the time is like, for anything that you do, if you do that thing for long enough, you're going to get to your goal, whatever it is. It's more a matter of when that it is if. Any goal that we set just in general is very arbitrary. It's, we have the end of year goal to hit $1 million in revenue, whatever it is. Like, cool, if you hit that goal a day later, you failed your goal, but you still hit it, right? It's just a matter of when and not if. So sometimes it just takes longer, and you need to put in more reps for it to really start to compound and for it to make sense. I've seen that for myself with, 5 years ago, I was just a junior marketer just out of university, and was at, 0 Twitter followers. And then a year later, I would think I was at, 500 followers. And this is just for Twitter. And then a year later, I think I was at 1,000 followers. And then a year later, I think I was at 2,000. And then a year later, I was at 5,000. And then the last 6 months, I've gained another 5,000, right? So like, it's not going to just be this linear kind of curve up. Sometimes it does have that kind of exponential where things kind of compound over time. But to me, it sounds a little bit more for you like an activation problem, where maybe you are getting in front of a lot of the right people, but they're just not turning into followers or subscribers or members or customers, whatever the goal really is. And so then it's a case of, okay, well, what's the offer? Like, are you intentional about driving people to something in particular? Is there a clear sort of call to action or value proposition of why someone should follow you on Twitter, for why they subscribe to the newsletter? I know for myself, for podcasting, I found that actually offering an exclusive coupon for each individual podcast works really well to convert those people into members. And then specifically calling out, hey, if you want to get to know me better, just follow me on Twitter and just go to spyfiles.com and subscribe. Like, those are the only 2 things I want you to do. And you can use the coupon code if you want to, right? But being very intentional about that. And it's really just about building up. So going back to the kind of earning trust at scale, I think that the at scale part is actually the easy part. And that's, the sort of like Orb Framework part of the equation. The earning trust part is actually really hard, because what you want to do is you want to build yourself up as someone worth following and someone notable, someone interesting. And you can't just like make that up, right? You can't just market your way through that. You have to earn that. You have to establish it. And so you have to build yourself up as a domain expert, as someone who's working on or doing interesting things. That's why a lot of people sort of like make up these gimmicks around 12 startups in 12 months, because that's new and interesting and challenging. And then that wasn't, new anymore. And then it was, no code. And, so you define these constraints or interesting ways people to get involved with you and activate with you. So, it's a long-winded way of saying, I think it takes time and doesn't happen overnight, but also I would take a good hard look at why should someone, from an outsider objective perspective, engage with you, follow you, subscribe to you, and is that value proposition clear? That by doing so, it's a no-brainer for them. Because then, even if you do have a small amount of people you're getting in front of, you'll make the most of it.
Cool, thank you, appreciate it.
All right, I think for our last question here, we have Natalia from the chat. I'm going to focus on your second question, Natalia. So she has some worry about starting on the borrow platforms like Twitter, somebody's podcasts. How do you convert those listeners into, like, same as what you were talking about with David? How do you convert them? What's a good way to get their information and get them onto your owned platforms?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because it spurred another thought of mine, which is that a lot of people only borrow other people's platforms or only have an engaged presence on a rented platform, but then they don't have anywhere to point them to once they do those things, right? Because either they go on a podcast, but they don't have like a strong social media following or even like a Twitter profile set up. And so then, like, what are people supposed to do to follow you or to engage with you, right? It's a hard ask, right? Even if someone follows you on Twitter, do you have a link or a newsletter or somewhere you can send them to from Twitter? If not, then that's also a missed opportunity, right? And so I think one, you just want to have those things set up ahead of time. Like, order of operations really is to set up your own platform and your rented platform, and then go to your borrowed platforms so that it has that downstream effect and positive effect, sort of all the way down to your own platform. But if you don't have those set up, then you're not going to feel the benefit of them. Now, what you actually do, similar to what I was telling before, was I think you need to get really clear on a value proposition for each one of those things that you do. And this can be, subscribe to my newsletter. This can be join my community. This can be subscribe to my podcast. But people need to know why. Is it different? Is it unique? Is it interesting? Actually, that term. So I was looking up the history of the unique value proposition, and this guy made it up basically as like, what is the one thing that really makes you stand out that no one else can deliver on, that no one else can talk to, no one else can compete with you in any way? We're all competing for attention, right? So what is your unique value proposition? For me, I think that there's some sort of intersection between marketing and the creator economy and no code a bit. Like, those are sort of like my domain expertise, but a lot of it is around marketing and audience building. I want to be the marketing guy for all the things that I do, right? That is like the thing for me. For Rosie, I think that Rosie is, the community builder. She's the community gal, or lady, woman, whatever you want to call it. But you can get kind of tricky. So establish yourself as someone worth following, but also make it really easy for them to follow you. So I have this thing called the Tiny Marketing Ideas newsletter. So it's just like a daily drip of small, kind of bite-sized marketing ideas. You look at people like David Perel, who's just like exploded the last year or so, and he has like 50 days of writing, and he has all sort of these email courses and downloadables and things that make it really easy to engage with him. Even on Twitter, right? You see a lot of people in their bios say like, download my free Gumroad resource, whatever it is. Like, have a no-brainer something to give people at each one of the stage. So if you're on Twitter, point people to your own platform, whether it's newsletter, podcast, whatever it is, that they can just immediately get value out of it. If you're on a borrowed platform, say, hey, go follow me on Twitter for X, Y, and Z, or go subscribe to my newsletter for X, Y, and Z. Have something kind of packaged up, ready to go for them that makes it really, really easy. And it could be as simple as like a checklist, or an exclusive PDF, or a one-on-one call even. But have something exclusive and very specific that you can point people to and say, hey, go do this thing to engage with me.